Hi, Lauren.
So
Great. How about you guys? Are you gonna come to the workshop? Come
Co-op
on.
101.
All right, this is our group then. Let's do it.
Take care, man.
So the first thing I'd like to do is find out who's here and why you're here and what you mostly want to know. So let's start with our first sit down. Yeah, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us if you're involved in a co-op project or what drew you here?
My name is John Titus. I'm a full-time student at Western University, and I'm not currently involved with any co-ops or anything like that, but entrepreneurship has seemed very interesting.
No? Okay. Cool. Can you hold on for just a second? Hey folks, if you're not in a workshop, can you move outside of the workshop room for your conversations? Thanks. Alright. Yes.
I'm Philip de Kracht. I'm from BOHEC, which is Worcester Housing, Village and Community. I'm also at Clark and at Telus Institute in Boston. I study sustainable consumption. I'm a researcher and a researcher organizer, and I'm sort of half involved in co-power, so I'm interested to hear more about
Okay. Is this the flyer that you left?
Yes.
Okay, great. I want to talk to you afterwards.
My name is Spirit. I work with the Cooperative Fund of New England. We provide financing for cooperatives, and so I'm often involved in providing technical assistance for cooperatives that are already started up or in the process of starting up. So I figured there's probably a lot I could learn from you who've been doing it a long time.
Great.
My name is Scott. I am a member owner of the Diggers Landscaping Co-op and on board of the Youth Project and use the Earn a Bike, and I'm very interested in cooperative worker co-ops specifically, but community ownership and generally trying to figure out ways that we can replace most of the services that we have with co-ops.
Nice. Great, me too. Do each of you want to scoot your chairs forward just a little bit since we're a smaller group? That'll save my voice a little bit and also help the rest of the Great. There we go. Great. So, we're great. So we're very into it now. That's great. So Worker Co-op 101. This is a small outline of what we're going to cover. I'm going to keep it pretty basic today. So, what is a co-op? We're going to spend a lot of time on what kinds of co-ops there are. We're not going to do much about history of co-ops today because you can find that in a lot of other places. We're going to do rights and responsibilities. How do you start a co-op? We're going to do lots of what can go wrong and who can help us, including some of the people in the room. And if you guys want to nerd out, we could do the co-op capital structure. So I think we might have some nerds here. So what is a co-op? Co-op means different things to different people, including the IRS, the state and federal government, the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. One of the best definitions of cooperatives that I know about is from the International Cooperative Alliance. So this definition, the International Cooperative Alliance is just what it says. It's an international organization made up of cooperative alliances in a lot of different countries around the world. It includes worker, consumer, and producer-owned cooperatives, so all kinds of co-ops, co-ops, agricultural co-ops, manufacturing co-ops. There's a lot of important language in here. It might seem just kind of garbly, but it's really important. So a co-op is an autonomous association of people united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. Jointly owned and democratically controlled are going to be two really important things that we're going to come back to. But those are the two key features to a cooperative that I want you to keep in mind. And are you guys familiar with this symbol, the Twin Pines symbol? Some of you are. So this is a bit of branding that we're trying to adopt for the cooperative movement, so that it's an identifiable signifier of the cooperative movement. So it was adopted, like it says here, in 1921 by the Cooperative League of America, which was the precursor to the NCBA, and it's used by a lot of different organizations, both as a graphical symbol and also as a verbal signal. So sometimes there are a lot of co-ops named actually Twin Pines.
What's NCBA?
The National Cooperative Business Association. Yeah.
Would we be allowed to use that like, on our stuff so I could put
Yeah.
Twin Pines on our flyers?
Yes. I think so many people do that, and I've never heard anybody complain that I think that this is not a copyrighted image. And a lot of people do variations of it. I mean, yeah, you should probably check, but I'm pretty sure you can use it. I think they encourage you to use it. So, why start a co-op and not another kind of business? There are some good reasons to start a co-op. For example, most of the time people start a co-op because they don't really have the resources to start a business on their own. They need to pool resources with other people in order to launch something. You know, you need to accumulate a certain amount of capital to launch your business. And those of us who don't have trust funds or other means of support have a better chance at this if we pool our resources together. Another one, a lot of people start co-ops because they don't really have pathways into conventional employment. There are people, for example, in Massachusetts who are still kept out of employment because of their criminal records. If anyone has been arrested before, they have a quarry record. And a lot of employers discriminate, even unnecessarily, against people with criminal records. Also, people who don't have permission to work legally in the United States in an employment situation are still legally allowed to become business owners. So becoming a business owner is a different thing than being an employee. So if you have some reason why you're not allowed to be an employee in another company, then forming your own business becomes a more attractive option to you. The third is, even people with all the resources in the world might just want to do something differently. You know, they might just like the idea of a cooperative. So I don't know. Of the people who started cooperatives, which of these was motivating you? Anybody?
I know another reason that is
Yeah, please.
enhancing the new economy or the solidarity.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that sounds related.
Ideal or ideological.
Yep.
We're changing the capitalist system.
Empower was formed because of the second one, because they were having trouble getting jobs because of the issue with the quarry checks.
Yep. So, some other reasons to start a co-op, question mark. Because it's easier than starting a regular business, right? Okay? I'm being flippant. It's not easier than starting a regular business. It's harder than starting a regular business most of the time. Starting a regular business is pretty hard. Starting a cooperative is a little harder. And I don't mean just in terms of raising money. I mean in terms of, you know, one person just starting a business can go ahead and do what they want, and they don't have to argue with anybody about the capitalization structure or the paint color or whatever. So it's harder to start a co-op. Another good reason to start a co-op, because it's cheaper to do than starting a regular business. Not so much. All businesses are expensive to start up. Most businesses are more expensive to start up than you thought they were. That goes double for a cooperative. And a cooperative, there's more on the line. It's more likely to be vulnerable people who are trying to start this. And so they're actually, in a way, even though it's like a lot of liberals and radicals who start cooperatives, in a way you have to be more conservative financially. We're financial conservatives. Because when you don't have much, you can't risk it. To risk the little that you've got is a bigger deal. So is it cheaper to start a co-op? Not exactly, because when you start a co-op, you have to get a lot of outside assistance. You don't have to, but often people do get a lot of outside assistance from people like me, co-op developers, from special lawyers and accountants that you have to go to that end up costing extra money. So it's not necessarily cheaper than starting a regular business. Another reason to start a co-op, because you're going to make bank, right? Not so much. You could get rich, and There are people in cooperatives who have made some money. I don't know about rich, but done pretty well for themselves through a co-op. But that's not usually the reason why we get into this. So, reasons to start a co-op. So, other reasons to start a co-op. We heard one. What else do you want to add?
I just wanted to add, it seems like, I think we're at a work or focus cooperative
Yep.
place, but somewhere just to have something in your community, maybe a consumer type cooperative.
Good point.
You just want that service in your community and you
Right.
own it collectively.
Exactly. So that actually, okay, yeah, that gets at a lot of what we're going to talk about next, which is that co-ops are set up for the purpose of. So remember that definition? A cooperative is set up to meet the need, to meet a common need of a group of people. And sometimes that common need is for jobs, and sometimes that common need is for organic quinoa, and sometimes it's for decent housing, So there's a lot of reasons. So that definition also talked about 2 dimensions of ownership, right? That ICA definition. What were the 2 things that I said? Very good. So the first one was jointly owned. And when I talk about jointly owned, I'm talking about money. I'm talking about the financial benefit. So there'll be books, hopefully, in your cooperative, and somebody owns the co-op. Unless you're set up as a not-for-profit corporation, somebody owns all of the assets of your business. And the people who own on the balance sheet your cooperative are the people who own it. So that's one dimension of cooperative ownership. The other dimension is democratically controlled. So these are the people who have the decision-making power in the cooperative, the people who get to vote on what goes on electing the board of directors, deciding what goes on in the cooperative. You can have one or the other of these, but I might argue with you if you call one without the other a cooperative. For example, you can have a business that has financial benefit for its workers, such as what? An ESOP. An ESOP or any kind of business that has profit sharing. So you can work in a business and at the end of the year, you have stock in the business as part of your compensation package. But you don't necessarily get a vote over how that's done. You can make an ESOP democratic if you want to, but they're typically not. So you can have this without that. What does this look like if you have democratic control without financial ownership? You know any businesses? Could be, yeah, like a collectively managed nonprofit. A lot of collectively managed nonprofits are like this. So it could be a very horizontal democratic organization where everybody gets a say, but they're not shareholders in the corporation, right? Because the nonprofit has no shareholders. Okay? Anybody, any questions on this? So, what is it really? A lot of people have a lot of ideas about cooperatives, and I think that the best way to think of it is, obviously it's a business. That may seem a little too simplistic, but it gets lost sometimes. And what I mean by that is that it needs to take in more money than it puts out. If it doesn't, you're going out of business. I've met cooperatives who were not doing their bookkeeping, had been operating for years and years and had never recorded any money at all. And I said, well, why aren't you doing your bookkeeping? And they said, well, we're not in this to make a profit. And I said, just because you don't know you're making a profit doesn't mean you're not making a profit. You need to know whether you're making a profit or not. So just because you work in a cooperative doesn't mean you're not trying to make profits. What it is that you get to decide what to do with those profits at the end of the year. That's the key difference. It's not that you're not designed to make a profit. Another way to think of profit is surplus. And, it's a semantic thing. I think as anti-capitalists, we get into this thing where we're not into profit, and we use this language about how the profit motive drives the economy, and we're not into that. But the reality is if you're not taking in more money than you're spending, then your organization will go under. And you don't want that to happen. Yeah.
And the co-ops who are non-for-profit.
Sorry?
And the co-ops who are non-for-profit.
Yes, there are. There are some cooperatives who are organized as not-for-profit organizations. The ones that I know about are mostly organized that way because they wanted to incorporate before there were worker co-op statutes. So worker co-op statutes happened in the United States around the 1980s, and then LLCs came around in the 1990s, and most cooperatives are organized as corporations or LLCs, as cooperative corporations or LLCs. The ones that organized before that, some of them chose a nonprofit model because they felt like it suited them better. So there are some of those that are still around, but most of them that form now are not forming that way. So, good question. Is a co-op a not-for-profit organization? No, it's not usually, except for the exception that I just mentioned. So is it a for-profit? It's kind of a for-profit. It's treated as a for-profit business. And like I said, it's most likely going to take the form of a corporation or an LLC. But technically, a co-op operates at cost. So it's kind of a third kind of business. So the fact that in that original definition, we were talking about how it's organized to serve the needs of its members. It's organized to serve the needs of its members to provide a service to its members at cost. That's one of the key features of a cooperative, right? So in a food cooperative, in a consumer cooperative, I should say, a consumer grocery store cooperative, maybe there are people in that neighborhood, the grocery store closed down and they had no grocery store for an hour drive around. They decided to form a consumer-owned grocery store to meet their needs, to meet the needs of the consumers. And they all put in $500 to develop the site and make a new store. The idea is that cooperative will provide them affordable, healthy food at cost. So when they price their products on the shelves, they're kind of making their best guess at what at cost means, right? And at the end of the year, if they've taken in more money than they put out, that means that they accidentally charged you a little too much. So at the end of the year, you're going to get a refund based on in proportion to how much you spent there. Yeah.
That's like the Park Slope Food Co-op.
Yes.
They mark up their stuff typically at 20%.
Okay.
The normal grocery store is like 60 to 100%.
Yeah, I would say probably 100%. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't realize it was so low.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Because they have like 16,000 members.
And isn't it all volunteer run too or something? Or no? They have staff.
Every member has to put in at least 35 hours
Yeah.
of work in a year.
Which co-op is it?
That's the Park Slope Food Co-op and Park Slope.
Yeah. 20% is a very low markup for any industry. That's
Yeah.
the lowest we've ever heard of. Yeah.
It sounds to me like that model or that government structure envisioned the type of co-op that's only limited to its members. So most food
Yep.
co-ops now are not only limited to their members, so whatever they're charging for their prices, anyone who's not a member is not getting that money back at the end of the year. So
Right.
they're potentially generating a profit
Right.
based on those non-member sales.
Exactly. So that's true. And if you are doing business with non-members, you are creating kind of a separate class of profits. So then you have like two streams. We went over this in Co-op Academy the other day. So one of those streams is taxed like a corporation, and the other one is taxed like a cooperative. It's a little advanced for Co-op 101, but you're right. But once we get to the end, if you guys have more advanced questions, I think we'll have time for those. I'm going to blow through this because you guys all look like you were the babies. All right. So, legal features of cooperatives. Few key features. The first one is subordination of capital, meaning that so most corporations are set up for what purpose?
Make money.
To make money for who?
Owners.
Owners who are who? The shareholders. Right. So a corporation is set up to make money for its shareholders. If it provides some other purpose, like feeding or clothing or housing people along the way, that's fine. But really its primary purpose is to make money for the shareholders. In a cooperative, it's actually written into the, to this court case, I believe, that it's not the primary feature of a cooperative to make money for its shareholders. So there's this concept of subordination of capital. You can have outside investment in a cooperative, but the interests of those outside investors are subordinate to the interests of the members. So there are pretty concrete limitations on this. So you can have outside investors in a cooperative, but they're limited in how much of a return you can give them. So I believe it's something like 8%, that you're not really supposed to pay more than that an outside investment in a cooperative, which is low. So, well, let me tell you who it's low for. It's low for your typical venture capitalist. So a venture capitalist who goes out there looking for businesses to invest in, they're looking for a return of more like 20 or 30%. And they want that high return because they're investing in very risky startup businesses, half of which will fail. So they need that high return to balance it out so that they get a return like 8%. Does everybody follow that logic?
Actually, you need more to
Yes.
50%.
Right.
More like 80 or 90%.
Right. So they're looking for the promises of high returns because there's such a high failure rate. So cooperatives don't work like that. You can't promise a 20 or 30% return for investing in a cooperative because the capital is subordinate to the membership. Second thing, one member, one vote. In a regular corporation, the way it works is if I own 10 shares of stock and Dee owns 100 shares of stock, when we go to our shareholder meeting at the end of the year, how many votes do I get? 10, and Dee gets 100, right? So he gets 10 times as many votes as I do because he had 10 times as much money invested in it. It's not the way a cooperative works. It's possible for different members of the cooperative. If Dee's been there 10 years and I've been there 1, it could be that he's going to have more invested in the cooperative than I do, financially, but he doesn't get more votes than I do because it's one member, one vote in a co-op. Any questions about that? The third thing is operation at cost, like I told you about. So the co-op is set up for the purpose of serving its members. It's a little different than subordination of capital.
Stacey,
Yeah.
just about
Yeah.
we talk about businesses and subordination of capital. Are there any co-ops that are publicly traded that basically have offered an IPO of some sort?
Good question. There are not co-ops that are publicly traded. It's part of the nature of the cooperative that you can't sell your share of stock to anyone except back to the cooperative. But your question is a good one because there are things that behave like that. So let's see. So having an IPO, I think we have time for this. We have until 4:30. So what you were saying is an IPO, a stock offering, which is generally a nationwide thing where you want to raise millions of dollars, and it costs a couple of $1 million to put this together. So it's done usually by large corporations. Twitter just did it the other day and raised, I forget how much money, something like $75 per user. So we should all be getting our checks in the mail soon for our $75 for Twitter accounts. So that's an IPO. So what you're doing is you're selling shares of stock in your corporation. That's national, and you have to register with the Federal Securities and Exchange Commission. That's a public offering. There's also a thing called a private offering, which is done by Equal Exchange, for example. Equal Exchange is a company in Massachusetts. You've probably heard of them. They sell coffee and chocolate and all this good stuff. They have a private offering, and the rules are different about a private offering. So you can buy shares of stock in Equal Exchange, but there is not a market for them. You can't buy and sell them on a market because it's a private offering. So you can only sell it back to Equal Exchange. And then there's another thing called a direct public offering, which is within state boundaries. So in Massachusetts, I'm doing this with a cooperative now called Sarah Co-op. Well, we're about to get started. It's going to be a direct public offering, meaning it'll be a public offering that anyone can buy into, but they have to live in the state of Massachusetts, which means we have to register with the state Securities and Exchange, but not the Federal Securities and Exchange, which means instead of $2 million to file, it's more like $20,000 to file. So it's still a lot, but it's way more accessible. So, for example, Real Pickles just did this. Real Pickles just raised $500,000 or $600,000 recently in a few months by doing a direct public offering in Massachusetts and Vermont. They were very successful. They were an existing business that was converting to a cooperative. And they were able to raise a lot of money in part because they are an existing business that has a good relationship with a broad range of New Englanders who like artisan pickles. And those are people who seem to have a lot of money to invest. Let's see, what else to say
I
about
have a
that?
question about it, because
Yeah.
if you sell shares,
Yeah.
then you have outside people who own these shares, right?
Yes.
And then you have the members of the cooperative are jointly owned the cooperative. So
Yep.
how does these two things relate to each other?
Good question. Excellent question. So we used to think that no one would ever invest in a cooperative outside because if you have outside investors, if you let them vote in the cooperative, then it's no longer a cooperative, right? It's some other kind of thing. But why would they ever invest their money if they don't get to vote on the board of directors? Like we've always been taught that in corporations, what you get for your share of stock is voting rights in a corporation, right, to protect your investment. So we always thought that nobody would ever do this. And cooperatives wouldn't want to do it anyway, because that would be diluting the effect of their ownership. It turns out recently that lots of people are willing to do this. In fact, they do it all the time. They invest money in their 401ks and in some kind of investment fund. They're not going to shareholder meetings of every corporation that they've invested in. They have totally turned over the power of managing their portfolio to some other person. It's not a risky proposition because they're paying a lot of money to these investment fund managers, but they're very comfortable with this idea that you invest in something and you don't actually get a money to. So as it turns out, a lot of people are very interested in social investment. The mechanism is that in a corporation especially, there's two different kinds of shares you can have in a corporation. You can have common shares and preferred shares. Anybody heard of this before? So common shares are the voting shares. Those are what your members have. And every person who has a common share has one vote. And then your preferred shares are your non-voting stocks. So somebody who wants to invest in your corporation can buy a non-voting share.
Can I ask one other separate
Yeah.
question about this?
Yeah.
Just the operation and cost.
Yeah.
How does that work for a worker-owned co-op?
Oh, right. Good question. Okay, so the same way that your food co-op gives you a refund at the end of the year if they're like, oops, we charged you a little too much. The way that you patronize your worker co-op, so we call this patronage, the business that you do with the co-op. So if you're a farmer, selling cranberries to your cooperative, your sale of the cranberries is that transaction. If you're a consumer buying groceries from your co-op, that's your transaction. If you're a worker, the way that you do business with your cooperative is by selling your labor. So you have a price that you're paid for your labor. So if you're paid $15 an hour in a given year, at the end of the year you have a surplus and you turn around and say, oh, we could have paid you all a little bit more. Here's a little bit more for every hour that you worked. We could have given you a little bump.
What's
Yeah.
it called? Was it named for it?
It's called patronage. Well, it's called a few different things, but it's called a patronage refund or a patronage dividend.
So the business is not necessarily operating its normal business at cost,
Right.
it's operating its labor relationship at cost.
A worker co-op.
Or,
Yeah. I mean, so this operation at cost is like, we're not actually trying to get to a net income of zero. We want to make a profit in these businesses. The thing is that right.
It's about the appropriation. 'Cause
Right.
In some organizations, they meet and decide what they want to do with the profit,
Right.
or some they just give.
Right. Because the profits are just the beginning of the story. Like when you get a profit at the end of the year, you have to decide what to do with it. And you might want to invest it in machinery, you might need it for working capital, there's a million things you can do.
And it also strikes me in the context of a democratically controlled worker cooperative that there's decisions about setting levels of compensation, right? Wages.
Yeah.
So that ends up having a bearing on the size of the patronage dividends.
Yep. Yep. The co-op can either decide every year how much to pay out in patronage, or it can have it written into its, sorry, that's not true. I was about to say something else. We'll get to that. Has anybody seen these international cooperative principles from the International Cooperative Alliance? So, these are, so ICA, as I mentioned, is an international organization. Co-ops may not surprise you that they're different all over the world. They're different in different contexts, in different national and ethnic contexts. So some of these might need some explanation in a U.S. context. So for example, 1 and 4 kind of go together. Voluntary and open membership and autonomy and independence. Voluntary and open membership is like, can you imagine membership in a co-op being involuntary? You must be a member of this co-op. Well, that happened, right, to a lot of people. In a lot of Soviet Union, it happened in a lot of state socialist economies. Autonomy and independence also is related to that. So it means that your co-op is independent from the government or any other organization. It's a freestanding business. Democratic member control and member economic participation are both the principles that we saw before, right? The jointly owned, democratically controlled, those are really key. And then these 3 came along a little bit later. So education, training, and information. Part of your responsibility as a co-op member is to seek out your own education, and it's also your right to have access to education about cooperatives. Cooperation among cooperatives is a thing that's come along more recently that we're trying to build a movement here. We're not trying to like build a one-off that's going to make us all rich and then we retire early. We're trying to build a movement for something different. So cooperation among cooperatives, and then concern for communities that we're not only interested in helping our own, we're interested in helping out our communities and families and everybody else too. There's no co-op principles police that's going to come knock on your co-op door if you're violating one of these. But these are, ICA has been really successful at getting these kind of universally adopted around the world. So you should know about these. So, what kinds of co-ops are there? If you think we were nerdy before, just wait. So, what kinds of co-ops are there? Imagine this is my graphic design skills. Let's see. This box here is a business, right? It's a cooperative. That's what it says. A typical business will have inputs from somewhere. It'll have inputs from people like suppliers, who are sometimes called producers, or vendors, people who supply either labor on a subcontract basis or physical products inventory to the co-op. The co-op then does whatever it's going to do to produce its product, and then it spits out the other side a product or a service which it sells to its customers, right? Everybody with me so far? It seems pretty basic, but we're going to get a little complicated later. So in a regular shareholder corporation, where are the shareholders? Are they, where?
Outside.
They're not on this picture, right? They're somewhere else. They don't necessarily have any of these relationships to the business at all. They're just there to make their money. So they put some money in, they take the money out, and they're not involved with this in any other way. In a cooperative, I'm going to make a case that there's 3 different basic kinds of cooperatives, and that each one, any one of these groups of people can be the owners of the cooperative, right? And what makes it a cooperative is that they have a financial relationship with the co-op, either as suppliers, as workers, or as customers of the business, okay? So when we have customers or vendors, we call them users of the cooperative. They're people who need the services of the cooperative. So in the case of the grocery cooperative, the organic grocery cooperative, these are people who wanted fresh organic food in their neighborhoods. They couldn't get it before, so they created a cooperative to supply it to them. The cooperative was set up to serve the needs of these members, right? The vendor cooperative. Does anybody know examples of these? What's a vendor cooperative or a producer cooperative?
like a farm co-op?
Yep. Most of these are farm cooperatives. So a farmer might be a dairy farmer, and he is in a cooperative with a bunch of other dairy farmers, and they sell their milk to the cooperative. They get paid for the milk. The cooperative then makes ice cream. They sell it to the customers. The customers pay for the product. So stuff moves this way, and money moves this way. So vendors and customers are two kinds of users who can be owners of the cooperative. Workers can also be owners of the cooperative. Their patronage and their use of the cooperative is through their labor. So where you measure patronage in like dollar value of like the milk or the cranberries or whatever it is that they supply to the co-op, and the customers measure their patronage by the dollar amount of groceries they bought that year, the workers measure their patronage in hours. They don't measure it in dollars, but in hours. Questions so far? I'm going to go over this kind of more, so you'll have more opportunities. So, in a worker-owned co-op, each kind of co-op has members. All of them are member-based organizations. So, in a worker-owned co-op, the members are the workers. Only the workers get a vote, so only the workers can have those common shares, even though other people can have those preferred shares. Any surplus in the co-op, any surplus that you've generated is returned back to the workers in proportion to the hours that they worked. So there's that, we made some extra money, here's 50 extra cents for every hour that you worked this year.
Is that mandatory?
Which part?
That last part? If everyone agreed, could that money go back into the co-op?
Yes.
If everyone agrees.
Yes. So typically what happens is at the end of the year you have a calculation to do, and you have to decide, just like everybody else, what to do with your surplus. You can decide, if you're set up the right way, you can decide to keep part of that in the co-op so no individual member owns it. But for whatever you decide to return back to the members has to be returned back in proportion to their labor. So, examples of worker-owned co-ops. Equal exchange. I was confused about equal exchange for a lot of years because they're so focused on farmers and fair trade. I thought they were owned by their farmers around the world, but they're actually owned by their workers, who live in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Red Sun Press is a not-for-profit co-op, like we were just talking about. They formed 40 years ago now. I remember that because they're the same age as me. And they're organized as a not-for-profit corporation, but not a 501c3 tax-exempt organization, which is a little different. Boston Collective Delivery is a new co-op that's organized in the last year or two in Boston. They're a bike messenger cooperative. Broadway Bike School is also, as far as I know, they're also organized as a not-for-profit corporation. Community Builders Cooperative is probably got to be 30 years old by now. They're a remodeling company based in Somerville. And Quilted Co-op is a cooperative that's bi-coastal, based in California and Massachusetts. It's an LLC, partially because of its multi-state nature. It's easier to go that way. That's owned also by its workers. I think there's 3 or 4 of them right now. So, customer-owned cooperatives. What am I going to tell you about customer-owned cooperatives? Who's the members? Owned by the members. Who gets to vote? Only the customers get to vote. Surplus is returned back to the members on the basis of how much stuff they bought from the co-op. So I'm a member of Harvest Co-op in Boston. When I go there, I swipe my card every time I'm at the register. They keep track of how much I bought that year. At the end of the year, they decide how much money if they have a surplus, they say we're going to allocate some money back to our members. And the money that they allocate back to the members is in proportion to how much we spend. So they look in their computer system, see how much we spent. I typically get a check for like $20. So other customer-owned cooperatives. Any surprises on here? Metro Credit Union, Commonwealth Cooperative Bank. Anytime you see credit union, it's a consumer-owned business. A cooperative bank is definitely a consumer-owned business. A lot of insurance companies are set up as mutual insurance companies, especially Liberty Mutual, is in a sense a consumer-owned business. I have my car insurance through Liberty Mutual. They send me a letter saying you're invited to the shareholder meeting. And I'm like, great. How many people just got this letter? Most of them are not going to go. I'm going. I'll be there. Lucy Stone Cooperative is a co-op in Boston that is a housing cooperative. And what they're consuming from the co-op, they're getting housing from the cooperative. So you might write your check to a landlord, they're writing it to a cooperative instead. That makes it a consumer cooperative. Remember, stuff goes that way, money goes this way. Did anybody know that REI is a consumer cooperative? All right. REI, when you go there, there's some places, you know how every store gives you one of those little tags? You get one at CVS, at Staples, at all these places, and you get the little tag that they swipe on the register and you get discounts for it. It's hard to tell, but most of them are not cooperatives, of course, but some of them are, like REI. So REI, they'll ask you when you do business there, do you want to sign up and become a member? And it's like $15 for life to become a member. They've made it a really low barrier to entry. But if you do that, if you sign up for the 15% membership and you tell them, you swipe your card with them every time you buy something from them, at the end of the year, you're going to get two things. You're going to get a check in the mail for a refund if they've accidentally charged you too much for what they bought because they're trying to operate at cost. And you're going to get a ballot for the board of directors because you're entitled to vote for the board of directors. So any place that you're a member of a consumer cooperative, you should be getting those two things. You should be getting a ballot and a return. True Value. Who knew that they were a cooperative? True Value is a really awesome co-op that I'm excited about, and I want to see more like this one. True Value and Ace Hardware are both cooperatives. So that leads me to another thing, which is that you don't have to be a person to be a member of a cooperative. Businesses can also be members of cooperatives, right? So, for example, those farmers co-ops, it's not the individual farmer who's a member of the cooperative, although it might be. It's his farming business that's a member of the cooperative, most likely. So True Value is a cooperative, it's a consumer cooperative made up of individual business owners, hardware store owners around the country, who all want to have that economy of scale. They don't want to each go to a separate, nail and screw supplier and say, please send me 16, 18, 8-penny nails and I need a box of, they're not going to do that. They have a million small things in there. And there's no way they're gonna source all that stuff themselves. So they've banded together, created a cooperative. The cooperative acts as a wholesaler. So the cooperative goes out and sources all the stuff that they need to sell in hardware stores. And then by becoming a member of the cooperative, you can see on True Value's website, they lay out the whole process of what it takes to become a member. I think it's like, I don't remember how much it costs, but you buy a share in the corporation, and when you do, you become eligible to buy through them as a wholesaler. They're the wholesaler, you're the retailer. So the thing about this is, how we hate chain stores and big corporations who come into the neighborhoods and what? Like, what's the thing that we don't like about that?
They try to like mom and pops, they
Yep.
cost prices too. I mean, they really look at prices.
Yeah, they have predatory pricing. They come into a neighborhood, they put their prices really low because they can afford it. They take a loss on that store in the beginning, and then later when they've driven all the mom and pops out of business, they jack those prices up. What's the other thing we don't like about them?
They take the profits out of the community.
They take the profits out of the community. Where do the profits go?
Alabama.
Back to headquarters. They go back to headquarters, And if you're lucky, headquarters is in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, but not necessarily, right? So the way it works is True Value is if you're a mom and pop hardware store, you buy your share in True Value. You do business with True Value all year. They give you all your circulars. You put True Value on your sign, on your receipts and everything. You buy a certain amount of hardware from them. At the end of the year, if True Value has a surplus, they return that money back to you guys in proportion to how much business you did with us here. That is the opposite of a big chain store corporation, right? Because it's like they're doing what they can for the little guy. They're giving the little guys that economy of scale. They have that brand recognition that people like. People like to go in a store and know what they're going to find, you know? But they're not siphoning that money out of communities the way a franchise corporation does. They're returning any surplus back into the neighborhoods. Hold on here.
Now, how do we know that True Value is reporting things like that? And like I imagine there's not situations like that. Anyway, how do you know that these organizations aren't just saying, oh, well, we have this much profit when they really want more than that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that's what it comes down to is like how democratic and how transparent an organization is this. So if I'm a member of True Value Hardware, I don't know how many members it has, but it might have like 2,000 members across the country. Not each one of those members is going to be really involved in the governing of this co-op. They're not going to have access to all those numbers about whether we're making money or not. What they do is they elect representatives to the board of directors, and then they trust those representatives to act in their interest. And it's only as democratic as any other representative democracy, which is kind of iffy, right? So it's basically just how robust is the democratic structure of your organization, and that varies from business to business. Scott, did you have something?
I was just wondering, are the individual hardware stores, could they be consumer co-ops, or they are not probably, would they?
Most of them are not, yeah.
Okay.
But
So
the
they-
individual hardware store itself could be a co-op, it could be a worker co-op, it could be a consumer co-op.
So it's probably like a S corp or something.
It's probably a sole proprietorship or something like that.
So corporations can be members of member-owned cooperatives or just consumer cooperatives?
They can be members of either consumer-owned or producer-owned cooperatives.
But not worker-owned.
Right, because
But they're not
they're not people. Only people can be members of worker-owned
Yeah.
cooperatives.
I feel better. Because the whole corporate personhood thing is
Yeah, we
a
don't
hot
like
topic. So.
Yeah, and you're right. That's exactly it. The reason they're eligible to become, well, I don't know if that's the reason.
Right.
Yeah.
Just popped in my head because I learned this. I didn't know what True Value and REI.
Yeah.
Why don't they, why don't they use that as bigger marketing tool?
Good question. I asked that very question to a member of the board of True Value recently, or was it ACE? Can't remember now. But I asked her that very question, and she said that she thinks it's because these have been around a long time. I forget when they got started, but I can't even imagine. But it's like more than 30 or 40 years. It might have even been like the 20s or 30s. I don't know. But it's hard being on camera. Like, I have no idea when they started. But they've been around a long time. And they've been around through some periods when cooperativism was not super trendy. So they're in the habit of not really putting that out there. You know, they're doing more of like a red-blooded American, helping out this, Main Street mom and pop small business. They're not really promoting the whole cooperative this thing because that's a bit painful for them. But there are people who that's changing for them. Cooperatives are becoming a lot more mainstream right now. A lot of people are interested in this stuff who didn't used to be. So there are voices on those boards who would, I think personally, that they would do really great for themselves and for the co-op movement. Yeah.
Look at that, this is on my iPhone. True Value Company is an American retailer-owned hardware cooperative with over 5,000 independent retail locations worldwide.
Yeah.
So maybe that is changing. So you're saying it's kind of like the Red Scare.
But they didn't use the word cooperative.
No, they did. They did. It's,
Oh, they did?
Yeah, in the
I
first
didn't hear it.
sentence.
Okay.
Retail-owned hardware cooperative.
Okay. Yeah. I mean,
To me, that would be
It's
something
like-
you want. I know now, just learning. That makes me feel better about the True Value store I went to growing up
Oh, yeah.
in the Virgin Islands.
yeah. Yeah.
Or even now,
Yeah.
instead of running to say a Home Depot or Lowe's, I I may seek out the true
Right.
value.
It's true, it's not just another chain store. And there's very few businesses like this that can say that they're not just another chain store. And it's true, I don't know why they don't promote it more. Because I think there's a lot more, yeah.
I was going to say, that's actually their Wikipedia entry, and then below it is their company page, which says it again. So,
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's true. They're very open about it. Like on their website, it describes the whole thing about the cooperative. But in their general marketing, you know, the stores don't really market this. You can go to a True Value hardware store your whole life and never hear this. And I think it's an incredible model. I mean, what if we had something like a Target that was like this? You know, what if we could buy our clothes and all this stuff at a retail cooperative like this. So the local store is locally owned, but it does business with a wholesaler that, because the local people want it, is sourcing more, fair trade garments and whatever else. Yeah.
alright, I'm just going to say something a little bit crazy, but there's this new website called Thingiverse, which I just learned about. Maybe you've heard of it, but it's basically this idea where you can say, I want a part, or I want this thing, and you can have it basically customized and then delivered to you. So there's this belief that Thingiverse. Yeah, there's this belief that basically we're about to enter a new era of retail consumption, and I kill off the Walmarts of this world because you could have this kind of direct to producer relationship.
Yeah.
So that seems to me to be kind of ripe for cooperative organizing. Right?
I think we should definitely be smart about this. Yeah.
And just think of like a website doing somewhat similar stuff. There's also, not quite the same thing, but similar, something called 100K Garages, which links like designers with people who can make it in their garage, basically.
Yeah.
So it's like a website. So.
I mean, the advent of 3D printing too is like scaring the hell out of me and making me feel very old. Because, I mean, it's really exciting, but also scary. They just made the first 3D printed gun and shot it, And it's like, there are people who are saying like this whole thing about like warehousing stuff and trucking stuff and like, using rail cars to move. We're just not going to be moving stuff anymore at all. We're going to be 3D printing it locally to home.
It's really comfort. Their gun is really crappy.
They're what?
The 3D gun is really bad. It's lousy. It's a lousy gun.
I'm glad it's a lousy gun. Because it scares the hell out of me. But I think it's going to get better, unfortunately.
One shot.
So anyway, we've strayed a bit. But yeah, the future of manufacturing is just woodwork. And it's true. I think that people in cooperatives should really be forward thinking about this stuff. So thinking about, how is it that we're going to be making and transporting stuff in the future? We need to be on top of this stuff because we're going to get left behind if we don't, right? So one more kind of cooperative. A supplier-owned cooperative, also known as a producer co-op. When we say producer, we usually mean a farmer. That's what that language is usually referring to. They're often agricultural businesses, but there's some other kinds too. So the members sell products to the co-op. Only the suppliers can vote in the co-op, and the surplus is returned to those supplier members on the basis of how much stuff they sold to the co-op that year. So Ocean Spray is a cranberry cooperative, grower-owned since 1930, it says, based in southeastern Massachusetts. Each member is a cranberry farmer, and they take their cranberry harvest every year and they sell it to the cooperative. The cooperative pays them for that, and then they make cranberry juice and all sorts of stuff and sell it to consumers. If the co-op makes a surplus at the end of the year, what happens to it? Distributed back to the cranberry growers. Yep. On the basis of the volume of cranberries they sold to the co-op. So basically it's like, we thought we could only afford to pay 40 cents a pound for cranberries. Turns out we can pay 45 cents a pound. So here's a little extra.
But are there like transparency things in those co-ops to make sure that? I'm not trying to belabor the point. I'm just curious if there is.
I think it probably varies from co-op to co-op. And I definitely have heard grumbling from members of cooperatives who don't feel like, especially these farmer cooperatives, who don't feel like their co-op is treating them right. Who aren't getting a fair shake from their co-op. There's definitely been grumbling about that. So it's still a democracy problem. It's still how much transparency, how much participation, how much democracy do you have in the organization.
another silly question, but is it just cranberry farmers who can be a part of the Ocean Spray? Or now that they have like all the apple cran juices and so on?
I don't know how they're handling that.
I never thought of it.
I would think, but I don't know how they're set up. So I don't know if like the apple farmers are also members and the blueberry farmers are also members, or if it's still, I don't know. I don't know how they're dealing with that. But it's true. I mean, every business takes a lot of different inputs, right? So who's to say that the ones supplying the cranberries should get to own it, or the ones supplying the sugar don't? You know? There are co-ops who are trying to create, like, multi-stakeholder cooperatives. There's a thing called hybrid cooperatives, which are generally, we think of like two different classes of membership. So the most common is, so I told you about producer, consumer, and worker-owned cooperatives, right? Three distinct categories. You can combine any two of those categories, right, to create a hybrid co-op. So the most common one is a worker-consumer hybrid. So Weaver Street Market in North Carolina was the most well-known example of this. They have 2 shares of voting stock in their cooperative. One is for workers and one is for consumers. So both of those groups of people elect people to the board of directors. There's like some proportion where like a certain amount of seats are reserved for consumer members and a certain amount of seats are reserved for worker members. I don't know what the proportion is exactly. So that's a consumer, let's see, exactly. Dorchester Community Food Co-op is starting in my neighborhood, and they're organizing the same way as a worker-consumer hybrid. Fedco Seeds, anybody a gardener? Yeah. Fedco's a co-op. It's a hybrid co-op owned partially by its workers and partially by its consumers. So there's hybrid co-ops, but then we also have multi-stakeholder cooperatives, which I don't even have a slide for. But imagine that, what's the name of co-op in Midwest called Fifth something?
Fifth Generation.
Is that what it is?
Yeah.
And they're trying to create a multi-stakeholder cooperative model that involves all of these, not just the cranberry growers, but the cranberry growers, the apple growers, the sugar growers, the utility company that supplies the water and the electricity, the consumers who buy the stuff, the mom and pop shops that sell it. Like everybody in the ecology of this business has an ownership stake in the business. And I can't tell you many details of that. It sounds a little unwieldy to me, but I would like to know how they're making it work. There's another thing to think about too, if you really want to get deep, which is what if you do, so that a shareholder corporation is when the puppet masters up here are like pulling the strings. You know, there's the whole ecology that I showed you of like the producer, the business, and the consumer. The shareholders come in from above and just like extract from it. They invest and then they extract from it. What if it was a whole community that wanted to grow a business together? For example, there was an example, at least one example that I know of in the Midwest where there was a situation where the only grocery store in a small rural town closed down. And all the people, this is not, a radical utopian hippie community. This is a regular red-blooded American town with 5,000 families in it or something. They were going to have to drive an hour to the nearest grocery store. And they decided that was not a good situation. So they had an organizing drive. They went door to door, and just about everybody in the town put in $500. And they were able to develop their own supermarket in the town. And they didn't market it as a cooperative, but it basically was a cooperative. They didn't sell membership shares and they didn't give a return like that, but they were all they were members of an LLC, I believe is how they did it. So this is truly a community cooperative, right? So if for example, let's say that I live in a town that doesn't have good childcare options, right? I'm not a child care supplier, I'm not a parent, I'm not the person who sells Legos to the child care center. I don't have a specific economic relationship to this place, but I do have an interest in it as a community member. I have an interest getting a good, peaceful education, because they're the ones going to be taking care of me when I'm old. So what if I want to invest in this as a community member? So there's people thinking now about, what about like a community shareholder model, where like your interest in this cooperative is not a direct financial relationship, but it's like a community ownership. Like I want to have more jobs in my community. I want to have better childcare in my community. I'm going to invest in it. So there's also that starting to happen, but it's cutting edge. Who has questions about what we just went through? Is that all clear as day? Great. Okay. So some examples. How are we doing? 4:15.
I have a question about management.
Yep.
For instance, in the Netherlands, there has been a farmers' corporation that over the many decades became very big and it had a big management structure, and in the end, farmers had no control over the corporation anymore because as in many corporations, it was basically completely management structure. That is the intermediate layer. Is that a problem that the council is just
I think it's a problem you're going to get in. I mean, naturally, the larger the business is, the further removed and the more diluted the power of every member. And there are some people who think that worker co-ops have a disincentive to growth for that reason, because every time you add a member, you dilute your own vote. I think it's the nature of any kind of organization as it grows. How do you keep it democratic and accountable as it grows? It's definitely a key question in cooperatives, but I think it's a question of organizational development in any kind of business.
I've also had a counter-example of Mr. Rabobank in the Netherlands, which is a huge organization.
Yeah.
I'm a member of it, and I'm a member of a very local, so it is completely decentralized. All the local banks are under the big umbrella of Rabo, but everybody has a local organization, a local vote.
Yeah, that's a really good example. I mean, you can set it up both ways. You can set up an organization that's really open to local democratic control, and you can set up an organization that's very inaccessible to that.
I was just thinking about the recovery movement as well, which is worldwide, 32 million people, and it runs on a basis of decentralized democratic government.
Recovery
AA
Like AA
and all of
meetings.
its allies. Right?
Yeah.
And so if there's when you need a new one, there's a new one that gets formed. And that's worked for 75 plus years.
Yep. So a couple of examples. Beyond Childcare is a childcare cooperative operating in the Bronx. They have a very decentralized structure. So all of the members who are childcare providers are members of the cooperative. They have these different committees: leadership committee, education, and publicity committee. As opposed to Union Cab in Madison, Wisconsin. Anybody heard of this business? Union Cab is a long-standing, almost as old as me, cooperative that was formed in Madison, Wisconsin after a labor dispute where the employees of another cab company wanted to join a union. The owner that they were organizing against pleaded bankruptcy, and he shut down the business. And so they opened a new cab company. What I want to show you about this is the circularity here. The circularity of the accountability structure in this business. So you become a member of the cooperative when you get hired in to the cooperative. You get hired by the general manager. The members here include drivers, dispatchers, mechanics, and support staff. These members vote for the board of directors. They can also run for the board of directors. The board of directors supervises the general manager. And the general manager then has the power to hire and fire members. So this is a circularity you don't find in another kind of organization. I happen to know that Union Cab has changed its structure since then, but the circular structure I believe is still there. Design Action Cooperative is a graphic design co-op based in Oakland. They also have this horizontal structure like Beyond Care. I'm going to fly through this part a little bit. And Equal Exchange also has more of a circular structure here. They have an extra layer of department managers but it's essentially the same. So you come into Equal Exchange as a worker owner. After a probationary period, you become a member. Once you become a member, you can run for the board of directors. Any member can run for the board of directors. That's one of your rights in the co-op. So you get elected to the board of directors. The board of directors supervises, in this case, 2 executive directors, who then have authority over department managers. So they're not businesses with no bosses. There are bosses here. It's just that ultimately you do have, some control over your boss, although it might be a long and circuitous route. It all depends on how you set up the organization. You can have a very horizontal democratic organization if you want, and you're also free to set up a very hierarchical co-op.